Be no problem at all. Okay. All right, if you're gonna cough, Jerry, move to the back of the room.
Sorry, I'm just choking on your lamb or whatever it was that you feed your chicken soup there. Got this door closed?
Welcome everyone to the afternoon breakout session for the Red Cedar Watershed Conference. I am Alex Smith. I'm a lake biologist at Wisconsin DNR. In this breakout session, we will get to hear about farming success stories from the Red Cedar watershed. Many farmers in the Red Cedar watershed are adopting and adapting soil health principles on their farms. Today, we will hear how Jim Kusilek and Logan Dwyer are managing their farms to increase soil health and profitability. First, we'll hear from Logan Dwyer. Logan and his wife, Amber, own and operate Haven Hills Farm near Chautauqua, Wisconsin. If you have questions, please type them into the chat and Logan can answer them after the presentation. Go ahead, Logan.
Okay, you're gonna have to turn that off.
All right, I'll shut up. Well, no coughing.
Picked it up good though.
Yeah, it's working. There we go. That's what I was trying to do. Okay, are you guys ready? Or yes.
I'm ready.
Right.
Probably want to make that bigger, like the full.
Yeah.
There we go. Supposed to start.
Can we start? Well, there is a delay on that, but okay.
Good to go.
Yep.
Let's turn this my way a little bit. I can even take a clicker and click through it myself.
All right.
Okay, I'm Logan Dwyer from Chautauqua, Wisconsin. Let's get this started. So we farm about 400 acres. It's my grandparents' farm. We bought it in 2016. We have corn, soybeans, wheat, rye, sunflowers, hay, pasture for the cattle, and we've raised a few pumpkins. And about 75 head of cattle right now, cows, calves, all the yearlings. Farm there with my wife, Amber, and daughter, Evelyn. How we got started, soil health, cover crops were pretty new and fascinating out of college. And I had a roommate that really was into it, and he drew me in. And we went to the Red Cedar conference that year also, or maybe it was the year before, I don't remember, but Gabe Brown was there. And he said, if you don't fail at one thing every year, you're not trying hard enough. So I took that to heart and probably took it too much to heart sometimes because I had some stuff that I tried too many acres and it did hurt me a little bit, but I learned a lot from it. Another thing was lack of pasture. We had too many cattle for the amount of pasture acres we had. So we wanted to do some cover crops and stuff for, fall pasture and late summer pasture. Also the soil health for subsequent crops, say corn after wheat. So in 2016 was the very first year we really got after it. It was our first year farming also, and we jumped right in on the grazing side. We did 5 acres of a really diverse grazing mix. Sorghum stand, clovers, we had a bunch of brassicas, we had all sorts of things in there. I think it was about a 12 or 15 way mix. There in the picture, you can see how tall it got, about 8 foot tall. And even driving through it with the four-wheeler, sometimes the four-wheeler start to pick up on the front end because it was just so thick. Here's probably a few weeks after planting. Cattle out there grazing it. This is when we very first started grazing. Probably gave them a strip about 50 feet wide at a time. And it took us all of a month to get across 5 acres with probably 30 head out there. So here's a little video of what it looked like inside. It's a jungle. Behind me in this video would have been a poly wire we string up every day or 2 days. And sometimes the cows, they'd get past you where you're putting up your poly layer, because we didn't have 2 reels at the time. So one time cows got lost in the jungle, and we had to take the drone out to chase them back in. It's out there on YouTube somewhere. Actually, very, very effective using the drone to chase cattle. So mainly the biggest stuff here is all the sorghum sedan, real thick, and underneath in the understory you get a lot more, all the brassicas and clovers and all that stuff. So by the next day, this would be down to the ground. You might have some stalks of the sorghum left, leaves would be stripped off, and everything else would be gone. If there's any tubers from, like, say, the turnips, they'd be eaten. This is also from 2016. We started unrolling hay in the winter of 2015. The idea was improve soil health and no manure. We didn't want to have to, no manure to haul. And so we planted some corn with a grain drill. It was all free seed. We got plot seed, and we're like, let's see what happens. So we planted it. And, with a grain drill, you don't expect a great stand, but got a good stand and they're good enough anyways. We did come through and put in some, I guess, dwarf sorghum or something. We just seeded right over to fill in some of the gaps. And our plan was in the fall, then we would graze this standing corn. And here you can see just the tremendous amount of worm castings. And this was the entire field. It was just covered like this. So it was mix of silage corn, grain corn. It was all sorts of things. Here's the cattle come fall out there grazing in it. So what we learned that year, clover, some of those clovers, they did not like that. Being in an 8-foot jungle it doesn't work. That's as much as we've learned what doesn't work all at the same time over the last few years. You want to graze covers fast, just so they can, keep them down, keep ahead of them, and then they get mature if you don't. We also learned that corn could handle being interseeded. We planted this corn, or planted into the corn, and the corn was, probably 1.5 feet, 2 foot tall, and we just ran it over the grain drill, and it came right back up, and it didn't care. The cattle, although it didn't work out for us, the grazing corn, they didn't waste anything. There wasn't a kernel to be found come spring. They were all gone. The biggest waste per se was the fact that you didn't chop up the stalk, and the bottom part of the stalk was a little too mature and the cows didn't utilize it. Our biggest issue with it not working was just a fence, keeping them from going through the fence. That was our issue. 2017, we tried to do the same thing, tried to change up our mix a little bit. That year we did a little too much brassicas, so it wasn't a complete success, but we had some awesome turnips there, as you can see. The cattle actually really like it. They have to become accustomed to it, but they will eventually, and they'll pull those tubers right out and they'll eat them up. So here we are grazing some rye with the cattle. We put this after soybeans, drilled it in, and we were slowly working our way across this field. One thing we learned is once the rye heads out, cattle will not eat it. They'll just about starve to death before they'll eat it standing. So here we are planting into 4-foot rye with a 750 grain drill, which works really good for this. It pretty much rolls it all down at the same time as you're planting. And we planted soybeans into here. This was corn silage. Then we planted the rye. In the center, we had some corn we actually picked. And so we got to look at both. How the yields did on planting into rye or just into corn stalks like normal. So I actually did a little custom planting for a few years there. And I almost got to the point where I just about started charging people extra money for being on tilled ground because I hated it so much, not being in, because it's so dusty and dirty and shifty, soils I was moving, and I just like planting into this type of stuff so much. Here shows you a little comparison. The rye and the corn stalks just really doesn't show you any difference, or it doesn't seem to be any difference. This rye was sprayed the day before planting, or the night before planting. That fall, we were able to get some yield data off of it. So we'd about 5 bushel difference, better in the rye than it was in the corn stalks. That could be from the lack of residue. I'm not saying this is a perfect example, but it was good, and it was good enough for me to believe in it and continue on. Also, where the cover crop mix was from the year before, we did some nitrogen trials. So we had all the cattle grazing out there all summer. That winter, we unrolled our hay out there, fed a little corn silage out there, and then come the next summer, we planted corn there and had a variable rate prescription put in. On the right side there, that was actually a corn plot, silage plot, but cows got into it. Between cows getting into it and combining or chopping it, we really didn't get any data. So that would have been our 100% nitrogen, probably about 160 pounds of nitrogen. Center would have been our half, I believe. Bottom left would have been quarter, and the top left would have been 0. It wasn't truly 0 because we had about 20, 30 pounds of nitrogen from starter. But that fall, as things were dying down and senescing, the corn from the road looked terrible. It was brown. Everything else was green. That corn was brown. I was like, man, you go out in the field and you did some checks and I didn't think it was going to yield anything. And when we got the yield data, I was shocked to see what it had done. It was quite impressive. I guess my rate was 150 pounds. Should have looked at that. Here is the cows grazing after wheat. We planted, I believe it was oats, turnips, and peas, if I remember right. This would have been the end of October, going on to November. The cattle were out here for about a month on 15 acres. And this is going to be the site where we did our next trial in 2018 for nitrogen. So the last few years, we've actually been able to graze our cows and not feed any stored feed until December. Cows don't necessarily always like it, but we don't really judge our feeding decisions based on them bellowing, more so on how they're looking. From what I've seen, cattle are quite often overfed, especially in a dairy area where we're used to just feeding cows and keeping them full to produce milk. A beef cow doesn't really need that. So we've been able to push off till into December with feeding very little or nothing. So one big thing we learned, the rye heads out, cattle don't like it. And if you're going to plant a cover crop after wheat, you should do it right away as soon as possible. The best case scenario, chase the combine out of the field or chase the baler out of the field if you're taking straw. Planting into rye, it's not an issue. It's very easy. Just make sure your depth's there and everything will be good. So 18, very similar. We've continued to do the grazing every year since. But here we did a nitrogen test plot after the rye, oats, peas, and rape, I guess is what was planted after wheat. So here's our nitrogen trial. We went from 210 pounds on down to 0 pounds. There was about 2 pounds of liquid nitrogen applied at planting in furrow as starter. There was a starter mix, but that was what we had from nitrogen. So here's our results. The sweet spot would have been about 135 pounds of applied N. We got to 190 bushel. But even at 0 applied N, we still had 150 bushel, which is, there's many farmers that have tried to achieve 150 bushel putting down 180 pounds of nitrogen. It's not viable. So it just showed that there is a tremendous possibility in doing this. Here's our 18 grazing mix. Very similar. Every year we've tweaked it. This mix here though has been 2019's mix actually is the mix that we've stuck with now. Well, we've kind of got it down to where we like it. There's another picture of cattle grazing through the snow. We don't graze in the snow much because we don't have any stockpiled forage. Cattle always eat it up before we get to that point. But I have no issues with grazing cows, even if they're above their nose. They'll dig through it. They're pretty smart. Another thing we do in our farm, cattle only get water when they come up for corn silage in the morning. Otherwise, all winter they have 0 access to water except for that couple hours in the morning. And I get some angry people at me once in a while, but there was a study done up in Canada that showed that there was zero effect on cattle not having water. As long as they had good snow, it wasn't crusted, and they had access to that, it was all right. 2019 was the first year we did 60-inch corn. We did silage and grain, and this is in 2019. And 2019 was probably the year where I bit off a little more than I should chew. I did way too many acres of 60-inch corn, having never done it before. We also interseeded corn for the first time, and we did relay beans and wheat. Interseed mix is pretty simple. We've stuck to it. Annual ryegrass, clover, other than we've switched our clover up to red clover, bayou kale, and purple top turnips. We did try hairy vetch, tillage radish, and buckwheat. It did not work. I would not try it again, except for if I was drilling, and we were just kind of broadcast to the light incorporation. Weed control, we did have some water hemp issues because we had went out with just Roundup. We had one other field that we knew had some water hemp. We hit it with some status. Still had really good results on the interseeding. It did take care of and help out on the water hemp issue. We've thought about Liberty. We have not gone there yet. Here's my interseeder rig. I built this out of a Gandy and a Williston cultivator. We just got one gang or one rolling basket per row. It's meant to go down 30-inch rows, and obviously it'll fit down 60s also. You can move right along with this thing if you want. You can probably go upwards of 8-9 miles an hour as long as the chains stay on. Looking down the rows, this is 60-inch rows again. That's why there's a gap. You notice how close the seeds are together. Population was lower than we'd like on this. Population was probably about 26 or 25,000 if I remember right. That's one issue with having a finger pickup corn planter is you just could not push the population as far as we wanted. So in 2020, we did get a vacuum planter and we're able to get a little higher population. Here's what the interseed mix looked like in the 60-inch rows. We had really good results. It didn't get, maybe as tall as I would want, but we had really good ground cover. This here's how we side dress our corn, and we've started to side dress with Y drops and liquid nitrogen on all our acres, not just this, but we plugged the one side, so we're putting all the nitrogen on that singular row there. We're probably putting down about 160 pounds of nitrogen. There was some turkey manure, so we would have adjusted to get to the 160, taking some credits. The one thing I really like about the interseeding is if you have any gaps out in the field, it really fills in nicely. And one thing I've started doing on my farm is the fields I know I'm going to chop, using a pull type chopper, I don't plant the corners because it always got ran down anyways. And the interseeding mix keeps the weeds from growing. So we don't need to be hard on knuckles and whatnot. Another picture in the row, this would have been the grain corn. Here we are at chopping. We had some rain events during chopping, and it really did seem to help hold the tractor and equipment up better than if it had just been plain dirt or, no-till. It kept it from getting slimy. After chopping, we were going to put cattle out here, but there wasn't much, and to get fence around just for this little bit, we didn't do it. Had a few cattle help themselves to it. They sure seemed to like it. Here again, this is grain corn. Probably would have been late November here. Here was the 30-inch corn that we interseeded. So this here's a little video after the 30-inch corn was harvested. This would have been probably just about December. Cows are very good at picking through this stuff, and they really like. Here there's a cow eating a big old brassica. They'll go through and they'll pick all that stuff out first, and then after that they'll go on to the stalks. It's one thing if guy's a beef producer and you have some grain crops and you're close to home, you just have a tremendous opportunity to integrate livestock at fairly low cost and have tremendous, it really helps your farm tremendously, in my opinion. But stored feed is not free. It's very costly. And if you can push it out, and it's that much more hay you can sell or just don't have to make or don't have to buy. That's a big deal. So corn silage results, we expected them to be lower, and they were. We only had 12.5 tons at 66% moisture, 5.5 tons dry matter. Whether it's right or not, I don't know. I kind of looked at it like a theoretical, corrected what we would have had if we had 32,000 seeds, and we would have had 7 tons dry matter, which is actually a touch above the state average. Grain corn, we had 116 bushel, also low, nothing to write home to mom about, but there again, I grew 116 bushel on 60-inch rows on 26,000 population. There's farms out there that struggle to get that yield off of, 30-inch rows. Not, it's rare, but it does happen. Relay wheat, this is probably the craziest thing we did that year. We planted spring wheat, 5th of May, we side dressed it with that same side dressed bar, and then we planted soybeans in between the rows. We did just 2 rows, 7.5 inches apart, skipped 15 inches and another 2 rows. We sprayed the beans once. The relay beans once was just some Fexapan or dicamba, and then the straight bean check we sprayed normally like our beans. Here, just planting in between the rows, planted really well. Just not as hard as I thought it'd be. We also planted into corn stalks. Wheat into corn stalks really is not a desirable rotation because a grass and a grass, you have like diseases, and it's not the best thing to do, but it's what we had. And it's kind of the rotation a person would like to go, because the next year you would want to plant corn into your soybean residue. Here we are. This must have been about mid-July, I suppose. Probably mid-August here. We did try to combine this, but using spring wheat, it was not at all ideal. It was way too tall way too short for the beans, and the timing wasn't right, and it did not work as far as trying to get in there. We tried to get in and combine it, but it was not going to work. So we made 2 passes or so and just pulled out and decided we wait till the soybean harvest. My chem program. So remember I said I didn't spray the field other than some Fexapan. We didn't put any Roundup down. We didn't have any grass control whatsoever. And we had no weed issues as far as grass. We had, maybe a few broadleafs, but nothing concerning. So here it is, the mix after we combined it. I'm sure the falling numbers were terrible, but if I wish I was a dairy farmer, you'd think you'd run this through a grain roaster. It probably would have been great feed. It was kind of a pain to combine. Just all that material going through, kind of like to plug. But the wheat stood, until soybean harvest just fine. There's no issues with it going down or anything like that. So the yields themselves were less than impressive. By all counts, straight soybeans, 47 bushel. Wheat was only 15 bushel, and the soybeans were only 28 bushel. What I actually did, I combined it all as once. I ran it through my grain cleaner and separated it out. I did sell some probably $9 wheat, not on purpose. It just didn't get it all cleaned out. But what I thought was interesting, the total yield off the 1 acre of land was 49 bushel. And that year, our soybeans only did 30 bushel and our spring wheat only did 25 bushel. So as it was not an impressive yield individually, the yield together off of a single acre of ground was better than both what I did in my wheat or my soybeans. So that's one thing I did like. It did impress me. 2020, just continuing on what we've learned, 60-inch, we didn't do nearly as much this year. We had about 30 acres in 19. We dropped her down just a couple passes in 20. Planted green and delayed termination of rye. So this year I actually worked with Veronica Justin at UW River Falls. She came out and did most of the legwork as far as what the yield was, and pulled different samples and It's nice. So if anybody's looking to be a cooperator in 60-inch corn, she's looking for some cooperators around the area. Her focus is, from what I understand, is helping dairy farms and how they can use 60-inch corn to help their bottom line. How do I go back here? Going back, we did get our population up a little better. We still didn't get up where we wanted to, but it was better. We're still 36 bushel behind on the grain, and corn silage was, I can't actually read the yield there. There's some stuff in the way, but it was behind. One thing to note on the 60-inch corn this year, it's not a super fair comparison because when I side dressed, I did not plug the one side of my Y drop, so not all the nitrogen was banded right on the row like it was in 2019 or like it had been done in the 30-inch corn. So whether that played a role, I don't know. Planting corn green. So we've done this a few times now, but this year is probably our best success we've had. In this picture here would have been rye just spread or drilled, I don't remember which, after wheat the year previous, spring wheat. And new thing we did this year, we started putting on 28% 2x2x0 out behind the closing wheels. So there's no incorporations, just on top of the ground, and it was UAN and ammonium thiosulfate, so we just had nitrogen and sulfur. Our goal was to get out 10 gallons. We only got out about 8. So it would have been 20 some pounds of nitrogen. And the reason we did that is to reduce some of the tie up, help with that carbon and nitrogen ratio and reduce some nitrogen tie up and help that little corn plant get going. We did have some armyworm pressure this year, and we've had armyworm pressure in the past, but this year is the first year we've felt it was necessary to actually go out and spray for it. So we had one field do 173 bushel. That field, the history of that field has been corn, beans, wheat 3 or 2 times, and we're getting started on the 3rd rotation of that. And historically, on that field, my grandpa farmed it. My grandpa was kind of old school in his farming practices, I guess, and did not put a lot of fertilizer. Fertility on this field is not really up to snuff to where people would like it. Potash really low, phosphorus high, close to a dairy farm. And I was really pleased with these yields for, in lack of better terms, I did all the wrong things compared to the norm, and it worked out very well. I mean, some of this, when I sprayed it off, the corn was just spiking out of the ground, and some of this rye was headed out and, 3 foot tall. There's also a little bit of clover out there, but I don't think that had any effect. A couple of pictures. On the left-hand side there, you may be able to see there's dark green strips through the field, and that would be where the UAN and ATS was put on behind the planter. This would have been on the left, would also been when I was and you can still pick out the head, the stalk, everything. Rye that had not put on a head was just gone and melted away. So it's interesting in how that worked. The last thing we did was delayed termination of rye. It was rye we spread in corn stalks after 60-inch corn. Just sprayed with a pre-Effexapan or dicamba, rolled it in anthesis, and sprayed post to terminate the rye. So this did not work nearly as good as I had hoped. One thing I learned with rolling is the ground needs to be level. You need a really thick stand of rye, and annual ryegrass does not roll. It just comes back up, and there's too much annual ryegrass in the rye from the 60-inch corn in the interseeding the year before. Just picture here. It's hard to see, but off to the right in both pictures, the ground was rolled. We rolled about half and left half. The soybeans at this time when I rolled were good, 6 inches to a foot tall. So that's about all I have on the crop side of things. But on pumpkins, some people found this interesting. We've done no-till pumpkins for 4 years now. This year's just a shot of the pumpkins. So we're planting. We'll plant about the first week in June, we try to plant. It doesn't always happen. We just either ride on the back of the corn planter and drop seeds or just pull a tube off the grain drill and we no-till our pumpkins. So after running through with a grain drill like that, just took the tractor and drove with the duals on, or take a roller and just roll the rye down and spray probably a quart of glyphosate on it just to knock it down. And then after that, we don't use anything else. And this here would have been our pumpkin patch, and it has worked out tremendously. It keeps the pumpkins clean and it's worked out really well for us. So that's all I have, unless there's any questions, which I don't even know how to get the questions.
So we'll see if they show up in the chat here.
Okay.
So
Well, thank you,
include
Logan.
them in the chat and we'll see them.
I don't see any questions at this point, so maybe we'll just switch over to Jim, and if folks still have questions, we can get to them after Jim talks.
All right, we are going to switch over to Jim's presentation here. Shoot. Okay. All right, Jim, take it away.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to figure out where I click here, but yes, Jim Kusilek. I've got a little bit of an intro later on in the presentation, so I will just kind of move straight forward with our program. But my conversation is a dairy farm, a good neighbor. What I'd like to bring to the equation today is really just a conversation. And one of the things that we want to keep in mind is that everyone looks at the world through a different lens. Water quality, surface water quality is a big part of the equation. Carbon sequestration, carbon climate change and so forth is the second part of the equation as well. And our consumer, the amount of money they spend on food is a big part of the equation. And as dairymen, as agricultural farmers, we need to balance that. We need to find an equilibrium where we can try to manage those different lenses. One of the things that I find to be absolutely amazing is the progress that we've made in agriculture and specifically in the United States. If you look back in the 1830s, poverty as a percentage of the US population was some 80%. Today, we've driven that down to less than 12%. Interesting as well is if you look at the percentage of the US population that is involved directly in production agriculture, some 80% was involved in the 1830s, and today we're less than 2%. The next key piece of that equation is if we look at our incomes as individuals and what we spend on food, back in the 1830s, we were at 50, 60%. We've driven that all the way down to less than 10%. So what that means is that we have more money to spend on lake homes and vacations and so forth. And it's part of the magic of the agricultural industry. Another key component of that is life expectancy. We would assume that part of that is that we have money available for technology, and it helps us in that regard. So some very amazing things that have happened as a result of improvements in agriculture. So one of the things that we're going to talk about today is some of the principles of soil health. And it's nice that we followed up a presentation by Adam, who also mentioned these items. And I think our keynote speaker at the first part of the day talked about these as well. So armoring the soil, having a cover on the soil year round, minimizing soil disturbance, increasing plant diversity, and keeping a living root year round, and lastly, integrating livestock. We want that for a couple different reasons. One of the main things is for our fertility needs, meeting our fertility needs. So how has agriculture been able to achieve the accomplishments that we talked about? And again, Adam talked about this earlier as well, but it's through technology. And that technology is a key to creating a food supply that is safe, affordable, and environmentally responsible. So if we look at technology changes, and this is a corn planter, as you can see, a 2-row used many, many years ago. But if you look in the front of that corn planter, you can see a black, what we would call a shoe or a boot. And that was used to put the seed into the ground. So in order to be able to use this piece of equipment, this is what we needed to do. We needed to have full tillage. We needed to have a soft seed bed that we could pull that implement through the ground, get the seed into the ground, get good soil to seed contact after we were done planting, and then we could get a good stand. The problem with that is the amount of tillage that we needed to do, as we're showing in this picture. Today's technology allows us to use corn planters of this type, some $250,000 for this particular corn planter. But what it allows us to do is to be able to plant into an environment that's not fully tilled. As a matter of fact, in this environment, there's minimum tillage. So that's what we call minimum till or no till. Other things that have happened with technology is the amount of active ingredients that we use in our herbicides, pesticides, and fungicides. You can see from the 1950s, when the technology was just emerging, the amount of product that was used per acre, it's dropped significantly. Actually, in an astounding way, that we have reduced our need for these, but yet it has allowed us to use that minimum disturbance. So now we have less soil moving on the surface, and we are able to increase yields. This slide was shown earlier in the day by Adam, but those of us that are interested in the carbon footprint per bushel of yield, as we look at corn yields, again, absolutely astounding. We take on this technology of herbicides and pesticides. We reduce tillage, and we greatly enhance yields. So our carbon footprint is being driven down. In the world of manure management, we have the same type of a program. This is what we call a bazooka application rig, where we can apply liquid dairy manure on a field. What's important here is the amount of disturbance. As you can see, we're applying over 12,000 gallons an acre of dairy manure on this particular field, and I don't know if you can see any. So we've disturbed the soil minimally, and we've been able to move the manure into the soil so it's not going to run off the field. So moving forward, and I have a lot of slides here, so I'm trying to move quite quickly. Is a dairy farm a good neighbor? Well, if we look at a dairy farm and what it can achieve as it relates to these 5 principles of soil health, we have the ability to armor the soil year round. If we raise alfalfa, which is a perennial crop, and we have that on a 4-year crop rotation, we have the soil covered. And then if we can use corn and cover crops following that corn, it greatly enhances our ability to do that. Minimum soil disturbance, again, through 4 years of alfalfa, we don't do any tillage. If we use a bazooka manure injection system like we just showed you, we no-till and we use rye as a cover crop. Again, we can do those same things. Can we increase plant diversity? Adam talked about a corn-soybean rotation that is very prevalent in the United States. In Wisconsin, through dairy, we have lots of diversity. We have alfalfa, we have corn, we have grasses, we have cereal rye. Again, more diversity. Keeping a living root in the soil year round, alfalfa will allow us to do that. Following cover crops behind corn silage allows us to do that as well. And we get to integrate the livestock manure. And what we're really looking for there is that organic matter that livestock manure offers versus commercial fertilizer. So we're going to show you a quick view of 4 Mile Creek Dairy. And what I want you to look at here is these aerial photos are taken in October. And what I'm most impressed with is the ground cover. It's green. So what we've done is we've harvested corn silage in September. We planted our cereal rye directly after that. And if you look at the fields surrounding our facilities, we have a lot of perennial grasses, we have a lot of alfalfa, and we have a lot of corn silage that we've harvested. And immediately after that harvest, we planted cereal rye. So our soils are green shortly after harvest in October. Now I can see if I can stop that, not do it twice. So 4 Mile Creek Dairy, we are a family-owned business since 1998. Much like Adam referenced in his presentation, 97% of dairy farms in the state of Wisconsin are family-owned. But my wife and I own our business in Hillsdale. We've grown from about 350 cows in our purchase some 22 years ago to 1,500 cows. We have 2,700 animals on site. And because of the forage needs of dairy animals, it allows us to utilize the lower value crops like grasses and to harvest alfalfa and reduce the amount of erosion on our fields. So again, we have about 200 acres of corn for grain, about 900 acres of corn silage, 800 acres of perennial alfalfa. We have some 300 acres of permanent grass on our highly erodible soils and in our grassed headlands. And then we have a few other crops that we grow, some wheat and whatnot for straw. One of the keys to making our system work is the timing of our harvest. For corn silage, we've been shortening our maturities so that we can harvest in mid-September. It allows us the opportunity to establish cover crops so that we actually get some good root formation for the winter. I'm going to show you a quick video. So we're trying to do a little experimentation on the establishment of winter rye as a cover crop. We have a couple different application programs that we tried. First of all, our corn silage was harvested on about September 12th, I think it was. And as the chopper was in the field, we were applying winter rye with a fertilizer spreader, and then following that with a minimum disturbance tillage piece of equipment, a vertical tillage unit. And we had about a 3% angle on the tillage unit. So that's our typical application of winter rye. And then we typically would follow that in with a minimum disturbance drag line bazooka application. So we're trying to do a little experimentation. So what we're talking about here is our application of cereal rye as we're applying it in the fall. We come in immediately after corn silage harvest. We apply our cereal rye, and then we attempt to put down our liquid organic fertilizer and allow the rye to grow through. As the chopper was in the field, I don't know if we're going to be able to hear this video, but we talked earlier about infiltration of water into the soil. And our original speaker, our morning speaker, spoke to this. That part of the equation is to be able to get surface moisture into the ground versus allowing it to run off.
And hit the stopwatch and see what we get here. So typically in a silage situation, the harvest equipment is done with large trucks. There's a lot of compaction in the soil. Then it's followed up with manure tankers, equally heavy, more compaction. But by using a dragline system, they eliminate at least one of those passes with heavy equipment. And so we don't have that additional compaction. And this cover crop has been, this rye has been growing here for about 6 weeks now, I'd say. We'll dig some up here. And, you know, there's the root system. And so that's what it's all about. It's not about what you see on the surface. It's all these wonderful roots hanging down. And he planted it probably about 3 bushels the acre, a little bit heavier than a lot of people are doing. But One of the things that's happened lately is that the price of rye has come down quite a bit, so it's much more available and not quite as critical. So, you know, we had an inch of water in there. We're not too much water's left in there. It has taken an inch of water. We're now at 1 minute and 45 seconds. We get heavy rains, but we don't get rain that is that heavy. So we're coming up on 2 minutes to take an inch of water. I actually just did this test in the row over here, and it took it immediately, so we're not even going to count that. So I think this is in the in an area that wasn't disturbed as much. And let's see, we are at 2:15. So what we're going to do is we are
that
going to
same
run
field.
a
Oops, I'm in the
little
same video.
infiltration.
There we go. This is that same field that we were speaking of. And I just wanted to give you a bigger view of it. The ticket here is that we have applied manure on this field, and we are ready to plant corn next spring. And much like was showed by the previous presentation, there'll be standing rye here that'll be anywhere from 1 foot to 3 feet tall, depending on the spring. What we're trying to do is we're trying to avoid this. And this is historically an attempt at planting a alfalfa stand and getting a large rain shortly after it was planted. Obviously the cover crop that was going to be put on here to cover that wasn't effective in that spring when we got this large rains. So here's what we do instead. Here we are planting alfalfa, and we're doing that into that fall cover crop. Again, as we talked about the principles of armoring the soil against erosion and so forth, this is one of the ways that we do that. One of the other things that we talked about were headlands and trying to reduce the amount of runoff on headlands because soil or the moisture is going to be focused on those headlands. And this is an example of that, where you can see the distance between the corn that's standing and the edge of the field. What we're trying to do is we're trying to have excess moisture run out of the corn into the headland and allow it to go onto a grass strip. Why are we interested in that? I'm a conservationist, much like the rest of us. I'm interested in wildlife and so forth. So much like Adam spoke earlier, one of the reasons for doing this is the long-term investments and conservationism. So as we look at this particular picture, what we're trying to point out is the amount of rain that runs off a field. So when do we typically get moisture run off a field? As you can see in March, the snow melt that we just had this last few weeks. And then we get it in the first part of the spring as May and June rains. Why do we have the erosion that we show here in the dark suspended sediment runoff? Because typically we've had a lot of tillage on those fields. Consequently, with these heavier rains, we're going to take sediment off the soil. So what we want to do is from this time period of January through July, when we get canopy on the corn crop or the soybean crop, we want to be able to protect the soil, and that's the use of that cover crop. Much like we spoke about earlier, the idea is that we'll plant that crop in the fall. It has time to grow and establish itself, get good root development, get some development of the plant above the soil. And it's there then to protect the soil through this, what I would call high risk time period. This particular image is from research that was done by the state of Wisconsin, through the state of Wisconsin. So here's another example of planting into that rye cover crop. Again, reducing the amount of sediment that will run off the field. Historically, in years past, this would have been the program where we chisel plow. We don't have anything green growing on the soil, and that to implement aren't free. They come at a cost. So winter spreading of manure has become very rare. We've made big investments in storage. Shortened maturity of the crop means that we have less revenue. We're going to get less yield. Hopefully, however, we're going to get that back in better soil management, enhanced returns in that regard. One of the things that you would look at is it potentially an opportunity for the owner of the farmland who maybe rents it to a farmer to participate in this by suggesting that there might be a lower land rent. Investments in seed and planting of cover crops is a big part of the equation here to be able to establish good cover crops. So the loss of dairy farms means less alfalfa, less grass, less opportunity for implementing these soil health principles. We're going back to this particular picture. I wanted to point out the field we're standing in is in some 100 acres. The field in the back, that is alfalfa that is turning brown and going dormant for the winter. That's about another 100 acres. So just in this picture, we can see some 200 acres that are being introduced to these practices. This is a picture that was just taken a few days ago. One of the things that we're learning about winter rye is we kind of think it grows right through the snow. Through the winter, there's enough sunlight that comes through the snow that rye will continue to grow right through the winter. All right, here's another example on March 9th. One of the things that happens is a lot of times waterways and road ditches and so forth that are supposed to carry water off the fields, it doesn't happen. So water will run within a field. You can see on the upper picture here, cover crops being established. The lower picture is corn stalks where we don't have any of that green vegetation. Much, much different picture as far as the amount of sediment that's going to move off that field. Here's another example. We talked about using cover crops, planting into them, terminating the cover crops, but still having that root structure available to hold the soil in place. So this is in 2017. We had the tornado go through Barron County. Lots and lots of rain. I would look at that field and say, wow, that's a success story. Very, very little soil movement. This next picture is an example of a field just 1 mile away, just a few minutes later, and you can see the amount of soil movement that we have on that field. Another issue is in the spring runoff of water. We've got a lot of soil moving, a lot of water moving on headlands. And again, we're talking about the ability to use grass on headlands to reduce the amount of erosion. Again, this is that same picture. I'm trying to demonstrate why the benefit of that headland on this between the edge of the field and the corn. Here's a picture of some winter rye that was planted at an excessive rate. Here we are in the spring looking at that same field. What I find to be interesting with that is that this greened up faster than a field across the road that didn't have a cover crop on it. The snow melted sooner is what I'm trying to say. So agriculture has to find a balance between the lens of all of the participants in this equation. And I think dairy is one of the gems that we have in our ability to meet the needs of all these participants. And this is just a final picture of, I guess, a site that we like to see where we have applied manure. Oh, actually, we harvested a crop of rye. We have applied a manure, and now we're planting a late season corn crop here. And the beauty of this is that we've got plant growth in the soil to hold the soil in place. All right, that is the extent of my presentation. Thank you.
Did a good job.
How do I get the chat room open? We've got some questions here.
So he was going to put them into this chat here. So is there any, we got
3 questions.
where do you see the 3 questions?
I actually had a note up.
Questions and answers, Q&A.
Okay.
So I can't see the first question.
I can't either. Something about doing any grazing, it says, just doing any grazing.
At our dairy, we do minimal grazing. We've got a few acres of pasture, but it's something that we're trying to look at. The challenge is just the how narrow the window is after corn silage is harvested. And so, yeah, that's the principal reason for the minimal amount of grazing.
All right, the next question, and I guess this would be for both Logan and Jim, was neonicotinoid use pesticides, treated seed. Any discussion with that at all, or have you guys, do you use them, I guess, or looked otherwise, or?
I'll let Logan answer that one.
I don't have much of an answer. Just I've heard about it. We've looked into it, or we've not really looked into it. It probably is on my seed. I don't really know. I've not investigated it. Yeah, it's something I've never really looked into, I guess. Part of my thought is, there's a lot of other things we've done that have hopefully outweighed that. At some point, there is a balance between getting the crop growing and doing good. So, yeah, something we'll probably look into the future. I guess one of my dreams has been to get away from treated seed. That's the only place. If there's any neonics, it would only come on the treated seed. We don't put any insecticide down other than maybe for those army worms, and that is not a neonic. So.
This one might be a little difficult. Do you know the bushels of grain per pound of greenhouse gas emitted? That's probably a little bit beyond what we're.
Yeah, that's beyond my scope.
Yeah.
All I can say is that if we compare that to the 50s and 60s, we are heroes.
Yeah. Well, I guess that would be one thing with a question would be, in your situations, what do you view as your amount of tractor use compared to what it would have been if you were farming conventionally? How much more horsepower would you need? How much more diesel fuel would you go through if you were doing the traditional plow, disc, level, all those things? You'd have a lot more investment in tractors and diesel fuel each year, wouldn't you?
Yeah, exactly. We did a little analysis on that. Traditionally, if you look back in the 50s and 60s when we were plowing, 10 passes across the field from fertilizer application, planting, tillage, harvest. Today, we're probably down in the 3 and 4 range of the number of passes across the field. And those passes are all through diesel fuel use. So it's a big part of the equation.
I don't see any other questions here. Unfortunately, I think we might have a little delay in there. Are there any other questions, Alex, that have been posted in there?
No, those are all the questions that we have received. So I would like to thank everyone for participating today, and thank you, Jim and Logan, for your presentations. We now have a break starting at 2:15 until 2:30 for our last keynote of the day.
Unfortunately, I don't think that we're going to be able to get to the next. Maybe we can. This thing locked off.